Hi, my name is Andrew Gunawella. Welcome back to the Burn Bag podcast. According to President Donald Trump, quote, nothing is going to jeopardize the truce between Israel and Hamas that his administration has worked to secure alongside Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey. Yet the ceasefire remains under strain. This week, more than 100 people were reportedly killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza after Israel accused Hamas of violating the deal in Rafah, killing an Israeli soldier. Israel says it struck multiple terror targets, while Gaza's civil defense agency reports that most of the dead were women and children in residential areas, schools, and tents. This week on the Burn Bag, I'm joined by Ambassador Dennis Ross, one of America's most experienced Middle East negotiators and a former senior advisor to Presidents George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama. He has a great book called Missing Peace, which details his involvement in a lot of those peace processes between the Israelis and the Palestinians. As the fragile Gaza ceasefire continues, Ambassador Ross is going to help us unpack what brought this war hopefully to a close and what it will take to sustain this temporary truce into lasting stability. Ambassador Ross, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So, Ambassador Ross, after nearly 2 years of this devastating war in Gaza, what, in your view, finally aligned to make the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas so far possible?
I think several factors came into play. One, I think everybody wanted this over, meaning I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, even though he was not signaling it in terms of what he publicly was saying, I think he realized he needed to find a way out. I think that the Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, the Saudis, the Emiratis, they all wanted it over. Turkey and Qatar in particular have a relationship with Hamas, so that was important. And obviously President Trump wanted it over. I think what was precipitating it for him is that the Israeli strike on Doha trying to eliminate the political leadership of Hamas. I think when the Israelis failed in that, and he got lots of complaints from not just the Qataris and others, I think he said, okay, enough already. Now we have to end this. So I think it was a combination of everyone seeing the importance of bringing this to an end, and President Trump being in a position where nobody felt they could say no to him. That combination is what I think produced the release of the live hostages and the ceasefire. It is fraught in many respects because the 20-point plan is understood differently. Each point is understood differently in a sense by almost everybody who's signed up to it.
So, in speaking about how President Trump was able to secure this ceasefire, you've cited Anwar Sadat's famous line that Washington, quote, holds 99% of the cards. How does that observation, I mean, President Sadat said that likely in the late 70s when he was president of Egypt. How does that observation still hold true now in 2025? And how did President Trump's use of U.S. leverage differ from his predecessors, including U.S. President Joe Biden?
Yeah. So two very good questions that obviously take you in a number of different directions. Look, I think on this whole question of American leverage and why is it the U.S. and no one else? What we've seen repeatedly, and I like to give the example of I went into Gaza early 2005. It was after Prime Minister Sharon had announced that he was leaving. Israel would withdraw from Gaza completely, but before they had done so. And one of the points I made to the audience was, okay, this was between 200 and 300 Palestinians who were there. And I said, you now have an opportunity because, in 1948, the Arabs said, we'll take care of this. But really, from 48 to 67, the Arabs said the Palestinians will take care of this. And of course, they did not. But Yasser Arafat, when we were at Camp David in the year 2000, said he told me he wanted to go to the original Camp David, but the Soviets and the Syrians prevented him. So I said, now you have this moment. This is up to you. You withdraw from Gaza. I mean, you take advantage of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and turn it into a going concern. Then the whole world and the Israelis say, okay, why not apply to the West Bank? But if you turn it into a platform for attacks against Israel, who's going to say, let's take that failed model and apply it? Nobody in the audience wanted to respond to that. But what they did want to respond to was to say, well, the U.S. isn't an honest broker. And I pointed out that having been the American negotiator under Bill Clinton, having been Bill Clinton's negotiator, I said when George W. Bush came in, he walked away from the peace process. The U.S. for the last 4 years hasn't been a broker, hasn't been an honest broker, dishonest broker, it hasn't been a broker, period. But nobody came in and took its place. The Europeans didn't come in, the Russians didn't come in, the UN didn't come in, because everyone understood the only ones who could affect the Israelis was the United States. So we've seen again, it's not that we didn't see Europeans or Russians or Chinese say, gee, this should end. We saw a lot of countries saying this should end, but no one was in a position to move the Israelis. The U.S. was. Now this leads really to the second part of your question. So why did it work under Trump and it didn't work under Biden? As I said before, everyone was reluctant to say no to Trump versus no one seemed to have a problem saying no to President Biden. Part of that, in the Israeli sense, is understandable because with Trump, there is no political base here that will oppose him on this issue. The Democrats already have a problem with the Israelis, especially with Prime Minister Netanyahu. No Republican is going to support Netanyahu over Trump. Under Biden, the Republicans would automatically embrace what Bibi was doing. Bibi would turn to them and say, they're pressuring Israel unfairly. And he would automatically have Republican support. So there was a political, Netanyahu had a political point of leverage here because he could use the Republicans against the Democratic administration. He no longer has that point of leverage because there is no constituency here that is somehow going to embrace him over President Trump. Now, why was it different with the Arabs? I think it's different with the Arabs, meaning vis-a-vis Trump and vis-a-vis Biden. I think the Arabs see President Trump as someone who believes in transactions. And he has a relationship with the Gulf states who also believe in transactions. So they see both a natural benefit by working with him because the transactions they see as being in their interest. But they saw something else. The fact that he used military force directly against Iran also sent a message that, okay, we're most concerned about threats from Iran, and he's made it clear that he's crossed the threshold and Iran no longer has impunity. Understand that for years, the Iranians have threatened, if they were ever attacked by us, to set the whole region on fire. And every administration, Republican, Democratic alike, was pretty much very sensitive to that. And it created for the Iranians a kind of impunity. And it's true, Trump didn't act until it was clear the Israelis had taken out all the Iranian air defense, but the fact is he did act. So A, the Iranians are weaker, and B, they don't have the impunity, and C, the Arab state looked at him and said, we believe in transactions, he believes in transactions, and he's just weakened those who threaten us. And he's also making it clear that he'll stop the Israelis, which they also want to see. And in the end, Biden could not make that clear to them. And Biden did not look like he could deter the Iranians the way Trump might be able to deter the Iranians. So it's this combination of factors, I think, that lead to why you saw a greater exercise of leverage at this point, and Trump's own decision that it was time finally to intervene in a way that he had not previously.
So I definitely want to probe a bit deeper into each of those factors that you just described in that great answer. So I think the first one is sort of my curiosity around, the Republican alignment with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, right? So you mentioned that obviously Republicans aren't going to prioritize Netanyahu over President Trump, but obviously it's a lot easier to prioritize Prime Minister Netanyahu over President Biden. Prime Minister Netanyahu has had a long career in Israeli politics. He's the longest serving prime minister in that country's history. He was there in the late 1990s during that Oslo peace process. But in terms of his, I guess, relationships with, U.S. politicians here, with the more conservative Republicans here, how have you seen that evolve? Like, was this a similar dynamic in the 1990s where Republicans were willing to prioritize Netanyahu over President Clinton, or is this a fairly, more 2010s, 2020s sort of set of circumstances that's a bit
It's
different?
it's more the latter than the former, and I'll give you an example of this. We negotiated the Wye River Memorandum, but we had a holdup at the end of that. This was the end of October of 1998. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House, not exactly someone who had a close relationship with President Clinton. And yet, the day we concluded it, we had a holdup of several hours because Netanyahu felt that Clinton had said to him that if he would conclude this, he would release Jonathan Pollard. And the only thing that Clinton had told him is, I would consider it. He didn't say he would do it. And so at one point, after we had thought we'd resolved everything, Netanyahu said, I can't do this unless I won't be able to do it politically unless I can get Pollard. And the president said I would consider it. I didn't say I would do it. I'm still prepared to consider it, but there's a whole series of issues that are connected to that, so I'm not automatically doing it. During this period, we had about 4 hours where we were stuck. And I think Rahm Emanuel called Newt Gingrich and explained the circumstance, and Gingrich supported Clinton. And he said, you can tell Netanyahu I will support the president. So as much as Gingrich at that time was a supporter of Israel, B, obviously someone who didn't make life always easy for President Clinton. But when it came to foreign policy like this, and that the U.S. had made a deal, and here was at the last, that the U.S. was prepared to close a deal, and Gingrich understood that the introduction of Pollard, he saw it as kind of, for whatever reasons, a red herring, and he was prepared to support the president. Very different circumstance today. Would you have Speaker Johnson, if he in Biden, if Biden had called up and said this, would Johnson have supported Biden? I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
So with Trump, it's not even an issue because the Democrats have been largely alienated, even before Gaza, from Prime Minister Netanyahu after he came and in 2015, came and spoke against what the Obama administration was negotiating with the Iranians. So there isn't that alternative political party that's prepared to say, all right, we're prepared to use this as a political lever against the administration. So it existed. I think it's existed since Obama's time.
Mm-hmm.
As first of all, you had Netanyahu, you had the Speaker of the House, a Republican Speaker of the House, who invited Netanyahu to speak to a joint session, and the whole thing was done without being coordinated with the Democrats in the House at the time. So this is, you already saw examples that the party out of power, at least in the executive branch, was prepared to go along and support the Israeli prime minister, notwithstanding what the administration's attitudes were on this.
So, I mean, while we've talked about how sort of domestic U.S. politics and the Republican Party, the Democratic Party dynamics with Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu, how that sort of played out, how does Israeli domestic politics sort of contribute into the Netanyahu, Trump dynamic, the Netanyahu, Obama, Biden dynamic, and then, before that, the Netanyahu, Clinton dynamic, right? Because President Trump is really widely popular in Israel right now. How does the domestic politics, how does Netanyahu's own political support in the country contribute to that? Because, I mean, he barely won that last election essentially, and one would assume that he'd be on very testy waters.
Look, if we look at this over time, I would just say as a general principle, if you have an American president who creates a connection with the Israeli public, that American president has a lot of leverage on an Israeli prime minister. Because there's always been a sense, one of the measures of an Israeli prime minister is how do you manage the U.S. relationship? And if it looks like you have a president who understands Israel's basic predicament and the prime minister is resisting that president, that prime minister will face a lot of domestic pressure. One of the problems in the Obama administration was the Israeli public came to perceive him, and very much initially from in the first year in 2009, because he goes to Turkey, doesn't come to Israel, and then he goes to Cairo and doesn't come to Israel. And the speech he gives in Cairo, which is an effort to do outreach to the Muslim majority countries internationally, makes a reference to Israel and says it leaves the impression it exists because of the Holocaust, not because there was a historic Jewish connection to the land. So there was this perception in Israel among the public, he's so determined to reach out to those who don't have our interests in mind, so that a prime minister standing up to a president like that generates support. It's very important. I mean, I was in the Obama administration, but I was in the State Department at that point after a second trip he made to the region where he went to Saudi Arabia. He went to Saudi Arabia before he went to Egypt. And again, he didn't stop in Israel. When he asked me to come over to the White House after that, and I explained, if you want to be able to effectively apply pressure to an Israeli prime minister, you have to demonstrate that you get the reality, the context in which Israel lives. And you didn't do that. I mean, the good thing about Obama, you could tell him anything. And, you know, he was analytical, he was cerebral, and he could get that. So he started, I mean, his was an administration that basically, in my mind, got on the wrong foot because he lost the ability to influence the prime minister by being able to present himself to the Israeli public as someone who really understood Israel's needs, and therefore there needed to be some responsiveness to him. Now, you could say about Biden went to great lengths to demonstrate that.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think initially he did. What was different here was, again, there's great polarization within Israel. Understand that by the time October 7th comes, Israel is already profoundly divided over the issue of the judicial reform or transformation that Prime Minister Netanyahu's Minister of Justice was trying to carry out. You were getting demonstrations every Saturday night of about 4% of the entire Israeli population just in Tel Aviv alone. So you had a great division there, and Netanyahu was focused on his own base, not the opposition to him. And his own base looked at any American pressure, especially after October 7th, as unacceptable. So, you know, he had, by the way, a coalition. It still has a coalition where nobody had an interest in a new election because they knew the odds of them being in the next government were very small. So for him, he was under pressure from the Israeli public, but he was under pressure more for a set of domestic needs to begin with. And then after October 7th, there was a hiatus on demonstrations for a while. And then they resumed over criticism of how he was approaching the issue of trying to get the hostages back. So during Biden's time, Biden had leverage at one point, and there were times when he applied it, but Bibi could say no, and there were limits as to how far Biden was prepared to go, and part of it was his just own natural instinct, because he's the only president who ever referred to himself as being a Zionist. No president before or since. Trump has never called himself a Zionist. No president prior to Biden's time has called themselves a Zionist. He believes and sees that. And to be fair, Zionism is used by some people as a pernicious term. What it really means, it's the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. That's how Biden identified with it. But it wasn't enough to put Netanyahu in a position where he wasn't prepared to resist things that Biden was asking. And he understood he'd have Republican support. Whatever he did, whenever he resisted Biden, he would have Republican support for resisting Biden. So it just created a very different kind of context. The politics in Israel today are not unlike the politics here.
Yeah.
Meaning profound polarization. In this case, in Israel, a government that effectively has minority support. It does not have majority support within the country. And so when you're in that situation and you're Netanyahu, you fall back on your base. You're not thinking about reaching out, you fall back on your base. And that's pretty much what he's done.
So, when we talk about President Trump's own approach to diplomacy, I mean, a lot of folks have described it, as you described it, as being transactional, right? So, a lot of the world, the Arab leaders, I mean, I focus on Asia Pacific myself. I mean, everyone views it as transactional. But I mean, in many ways, the diplomacy is also very much highly personal, and some have described it as coercive. Uh, I mean, like when we're looking at, who's been doing the negotiating, we're identifying, Steve Witkoff, and then, of course, Jared Kushner, who has now returned to the scene after being in the private sector and not choosing to serve in the administration. And we're at least in the headlines, right? Like I'm hearing less about, say, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, doing a lot of those negotiations. So how does that highly personalized approach, how does the approach of these individuals uh, differ from, I guess, what some may describe as the process driven diplomacy that has marked prior administrations?
Right. Although I will say this, when I was the negotiator, people used to always say, does President Clinton know what you're doing? And I would say he always knows what I'm doing. Sometimes before I do it, sometimes after I do it. He gave me a license as a negotiator. But the point about the personal nature of this, especially in the Middle East, Arab leaders, for the most part, personalize all of this. So they're focused on their personal relationship with the president. If you have Steve Witkoff, you have Jared Kushner, they're obviously close to the president, and they're seen as authoritative because of that. In the Middle East, they can sense lack of authority very quickly. Arab leaders understand that this is highly personalized for President Trump, but it's also highly personalized for them. So it's in some ways it makes it easier for them. It's not they're not there's less process and there's more kind of okay, we'll operate this at a high level of generality. It will raise issues like we're seeing now. You look at the 20-point plan and it's really a set of broad general principles. It's not a roadmap for how you take those principles and translate them. What are the mechanisms to be able to do that? For example, what's the mechanism to produce disarmament in Gaza? Well, right now, there isn't one. It'll still have to be created. And the longer it takes to do that, the harder it will become. So in a sense, you need to find a way to marry both. You need to find a way to take the personal nature of this, especially with Arab leaders, and the kind of broad brush agreement, which sometimes if you're not prepared to do the broad brush agreement, you won't get an agreement at all. So it was important to do this at a general level. The instinct that Trump had, let's at least get an agreement on this so we can launch a process, that was an important thing to do, and it represented a breakthrough, not for the least that the fact that you have 20 live hostages who might not have survived had it not been for this. We're seeing that the 28 dead hostage bodies, only 15 have been returned at this point. Pretty clear Hamas is playing games, and we've even seen one of these documented by taking a body in a bag out of a building, burying it, and then bringing Red Cross people there, and unearthing it for them as if they had just discovered it. So they're playing games, and that lends itself when the understandings are not as detailed as you would like them to be, you end up in a situation where the potential for everybody to interpret things the way they want becomes much more apparent. I still think the achievement of getting the ceasefire, capitalizing the fact that everybody really wanted this to end, no one is really looking for it to resume, that was an important threshold to cross. Now, whether we can get from phase one, which is not yet complete, to phase two will be the real challenge.
So President Trump, I think, in a recent Time magazine article slash interview, he linked those strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities and bringing both, Hamas and Netanyahu to that table. At the time of those strikes, did you view that as credible coercive leverage in trying to get this done? And how have you viewed it sort of differently now that the ceasefire is in place and we have cooperation from these Arab countries and leaders?
So you mentioned my book, The Missing Piece, but I have a new book out. It's called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. And some of the lessons I draw from that, apropos of your question, one, I say timing is to statecraft what location is to real estate. And here, there was a moment and Trump recognized it. But two, I say to capitalize on moments, diplomacy works when it's backed by real leverage, when it's backed by coercion. Now, that can be negative and positive. You can offer leverage, can be offered by rewards that someone's going to get if they respond, but also by the penalties they're going to pay or the consequences they're going to suffer if they don't. And I think what we saw here is that the willingness of Trump to use force had an effect on Israelis and Arabs alike. In the case of Netanyahu, the most important issue that he's always identified as the most important issue to him personally has been the Iran nuclear program. And for Trump to follow through and hit three targets, the Israelis had hit two of the three. Fordo was an enrichment site built into a mountain. Whenever I hear people say you need bunker busters for it, I say wrong. You need mountain busters for it. And the massive ordnance penetrator, which we used, 12 of them, these are 30,000-pound bombs with a fuse that doesn't ignite until it's deep underground. Israel could not destroy Fordo. It could hit Natanz, it could hit Isfahan, and it did, but we hit those targets as well. It was a one-off for Trump, but it was dramatic. And for Netanyahu, it meant you put Trump on a pedestal. Well, once you put him on a pedestal, then you can't knock him off. You can't say no to him. So he really can't say no to Trump. And we're seeing it. You have in Israel, they're calling it babysitters. The constant stream of, you had Witkoff and Kushner, who are actually still there. Then you have Vance. Then you have Rubio. This week you have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Next week you have Witkoff's deputy. So it's a constant stream of people, and it reflects the fact that they want to make sure the ceasefire doesn't break down, and by being there, they can help limit what is done, especially on the Israeli side. And even the Israeli response to the killing of why did Netanyahu respond? By the way, he doesn't respond until after he gets the okay from the administration. Whatever he's saying, this was run by the administration before he did it. The administration took the killing of this Israeli soldier, who was actually in engineering. There was a bulldozer he was using to dig up parts of a tunnel, and you had Hamas operatives come out of a tunnel, and they fired an anti-tank missile, and there was also a sniper. That's what led to his killing. And so there was that, and there was this subterfuge with the one hostage body, and the fact that they haven't been turning over hostage bodies, that Trump has become more threatening in his language towards Hamas, but it's not about what we'll do. It's about, in a sense, giving the Israelis a license. But so they were given a license to carry out a set of strikes, but then it had to stop. And it did. So in a sense, you're seeing the coercion played an important part to get the deal, especially because of Iran, but that also, it had an effect not only on the Israelis, it had an effect on the Arabs. Nobody in the Arab world cries crocodile tears over the Iranian nuclear program being set back dramatically. Nobody. Maybe they're not out there publicly doing handstands and endorsing it, but nobody's crying crocodile tears over it. So it sends a message. If Trump says he's prepared to do something, he will actually go ahead and do it, especially as it relates to pressure. So it has, I've often said one can talk about diplomacy, but the idea that if you have nothing that backs the diplomacy, if there's no consequence to saying yes or no, you'll have a hard time getting to yes, but you'll have a very easy time producing a no.
So, with the ceasefire, the durability of it, I mean, what are the early signs that we should watch to actually know whether this thing is going to last or whether it's going to be, broken for good?
So I think the most important thing to watch for is how soon do we see the Board of Peace set up? How soon do we see there's really three elements that are the key to implementation. And they're also the key to implementation because they represent an alternative administration within Gaza. And so long as you don't have an alternative administration in Gaza, you have a vacuum. And in the part of Gaza that Hamas now controls, they will cement that control. If the 20 points is supposed to produce an alternative to Hamas, and Hamas will no longer be in control directly or indirectly, the longer it takes to put the Board of Peace, the technocratic Palestinian day-to-day administrative committee, and the International Stabilization Force on the ground, the less confident you can have that the elements of the 20 points are going to be carried out. And we haven't seen, Board of Peace hasn't been established yet. The technocratic Palestinian administration hasn't been established yet, and the International Stabilization Force hasn't been established yet. And it's clear there's not a clear mandate that's agreed by everybody for what the International Stabilization Force should be. Though this, for me, this is the most worrisome sign about whether or not we will see a phase two actually get implemented.
Yeah, and I mean, this phase two would involve disarmament, governance, and actual reconstruction. I mean, let's say, that stuff happens, right? And we're able to move into phase two. I mean, what design principles from your perspective are actually essential for this to work, for the stabilization force, for the interim administration, for it to actually function well? You talk about a lack of a mandate. So,
Well, I think the key, you put your finger on something because disarmament, there's a nexus here. You don't get Israeli withdrawal without disarmament. Now, the way the 20 points are written, it's a phased approach to withdrawal, but it's also a phased approach to disarmament. So you need that, but you also need it because there'll be no reconstruction without it. The Saudis and Emiratis have made it clear they will not invest in reconstruction unless Gaza is demilitarized, unless Hamas is disarmed. They say that because under those circumstances, if Hamas is not disarmed, they will find a way to reconstitute, and maybe it'll take years, but they'll do this once again. So why would we invest in reconstruction knowing they'll do it again? So this disarmament is the key to both Israeli withdrawal and investment, serious reconstruction for serious investment for reconstruction. So this is the nexus to keep your eye on. Now, can we get there? Again, I don't dismiss the leverage that Trump has. I don't dismiss the fact that nobody really wants us to resume. There's a hard nut to crack here because Hamas is saying, well, we won't withdraw. On the other hand, Turkey, Qatar are trying to get Hamas to rebrand itself. They're trying to get it to give up its military wing. They're trying to get it to engage in what would be some, at least at a minimum, some symbolic disarmament. Egypt is trying to put together an all-Palestinian dialogue that would include the PA as well as Hamas. But again, to reach an understanding that it's the PA that will have responsibility over time. Netanyahu's opposition to the PA in Gaza is not what will prevent this, because if you read again the 20 points, the PA has a role to play provided it reforms. Now that's also another key element here. The PA has very little credibility within the West Bank, where it has a governing responsibility. It is rife with corruption. The prime minister is a capable person, but he has no independence. And the reform, no one buys the reform that's been presented on paper. No one buys it will be implemented. Point 19 of the 20 points is important because it was designed to address what the Arabs have wanted, which is a political horizon. They want to know, look, we're not just going to transform Gaza, but they want to know how it relates to a political horizon for the Palestinians. And point 19 says if uh, the Palestinian Authority faithfully implements reform, that will set the stage for being able to for a path that will achieve Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which are the aspirations of the Palestinian people. So here's the political vision, but it's actually tied to the issue of reform of the PA. Reform of the PA, in my mind, is one of the there's more than one synonym for this working. It's the disarmament, but it's also the reform of the PA because the Arabs don't want to go in. If they're part of the International Stabilization Force, they don't want to be there forever. They want to be able to hand this over. And by the way, you can't talk about a Palestinian state if you can't politically reunify the West Bank and Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
So all these things, you're asking for a few indicators. I'm giving you more than a few. But what it boils down to, in my mind, is I'd say four elements: disarmament, withdrawal, reconstruction, reform of the PA. You get those four, you'll have an international stabilization force. My argument about the international stabilization force is it needs to provide law and order and public safety and protection of the Gazan public. Hamas immediately sought to reassert its control as a way of signaling the public, we're not going anywhere. Don't even think that you're going to be free of us. And if you don't provide protection and public safety, it'll be difficult for Hamas not to reemerge over time, even if they are prepared to say, yeah, we'll support a technocratic government, and we'll do something symbolic on arms, but basically we're going to insinuate ourselves here and we'll maintain our ability to heavily influence what happens.
So, do you believe that the Arab countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, do you think that they can maintain a unified front in implementing this agreement? I mean, you sort of referred to, the idea of the agreement earlier as everyone has a different understanding of every single principle in those 20 points.
Right.
Do you think they can be unified, or do you believe that divergent priorities might re-emerge should reconstruction actually commence?
I am concerned about that. I've raised what I think is a critical nexus. It is interesting to me that, while President Trump, in the case of diplomatic understatement, I'll say, he might be prone to exaggeration from time to time. When he said that he was being asked by everybody to be the CEO of this Board of Peace, he was not exaggerating because everyone understands that if he doesn't stay engaged, if this isn't a continuing interest for him, that the chances of this being implemented basically become very small. But so long as he's engaged and this is an issue for him and he will press in certain moments, the chances of overcoming all these problems will exist. Look, it's not a given, but at least there's a possibility. We didn't even have the possibility before. So that's why when people ask me, are you optimistic? I say, no, but I'm hopeful. Because people who are optimistic always think things will simply work out. And one thing I know about having spent a lot of time in the Middle East,
Yeah.
nothing ever works out on its own. The only way it works out is if you work it to the point where everybody's left with no choice. Now, I think that's the good news. The less good news is you have a stream of Americans who've been there. You really need teams of experts who know each of these issues and know how to begin to act on them. The more we see signs the administration invests that way, the more confidence I will have that this can actually go from being just a possibility to something that might actually happen.
So, during the course of this awful war, I mean, Israel has faced a lot of growing international criticism and political isolation. Obviously, a lot of allegations around genocide by international bodies. Do you believe, though, that Israel actually is internationally isolated and politically isolated? And if you believe that, how does Israel rebuild credibility in a diplomatic sense. I mean, I had heard, I think, rumors around Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto visiting Israel a few weeks ago. I mean, that's one of the largest Muslim countries in the world. Clearly, that visit didn't manifest, and the government of Indonesia had disputed that. But should that visit have happened, that would have been a clear signal, right? But I mean, what's your take on Israel's political status diplomatically?
I do think it's never been so isolated. That's why Trump has even more leverage, because the last thing that Netanyahu can afford is to alienate Trump. And look at that same Time magazine article interview that you cited. In it, Trump makes it very clear on the issue of annexation. It's not going to go ahead. And if it did, they would, Israel would lose America's support. We've never seen him be quite that blunt before. So um, there's a clear understanding on Netanyahu's part. You cannot alienate the U.S. at this point, given what's happened to Israel internationally. So how do you ask the right question? How does Israel reestablish? Because Israel had the image of being the startup nation, and basically everybody was dealing with it. In the high tech sector, it was, I'll mix my metaphors, it was a mecca.
Mm-hmm.
And one way it can begin to recover from that is, again, for that part of Israel to assume greater visibility and prominence. Israel will have an election next year. And my guess is that election has to take place by a year from now. My guess is it's going to happen much sooner than that. It could happen as early as February. I feel certain it'll happen by June 1. So that actually creates an interesting possibility for Israel, because you have an election. If the outcome of the election produces a different government, that government says, hey, look, we weren't responsible for a lot of what happened here. And that government makes an effort to do a lot of outreach. You could have a different government with the same prime minister. If you look at the polling, the current coalition, there's no way the current coalition is going to return in power. No way. For Prime Minister Netanyahu, the key is preventing the opposition from getting to 61. If you look at the polling, they've been there or close to that. If Netanyahu can prevent them from getting to 61, he can prevent them from forming a government. If you don't want to be stuck with no government, then they compromise with him, but it means people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the most extreme of the government, are gone, out of important cabinet positions, and all the leaders of the opposition assume those positions. That too creates the possibility of a different kind of branding. But it will take, in essence, and really to get to the heart of what you're asking, it will take a very determined Israeli outreach, number one. It will take an effort at emphasizing its outreach. It will take this process actually proceeding. If you see the transformation of Gaza, if you see a dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians, which is the 20th point, by the way, the U.S. is going to facilitate that, then you suddenly have a different climate. Some of the key Arab states, then have more of a justification to start being prepared to do more with Israel. Clearly, it will be easier if it's a different Israeli government. This Israeli government is, in the eyes of the region, and most of the international community, has a taint. A different Israeli government can also provide an excuse for those on the outside who may feel, look, our publics don't understand why we would be embracing Israel, but now we have a pretext to go back to the kind of business we were doing with it before. So I think it takes a determined effort on Israel's part to present a different face. If the context shows there's a process that now appears to be working, that changes the climate. If Israel does what it has done in the past, and even today, look, in many of the governance of India, you have Israeli teams working to improve the agriculture there. Israel has, it leads the world in the use of wastewater, the reuse of wastewater, leads the world in terms of drip irrigation, including, it leads the world actually in terms of underground irrigation. Its use of AI for agriculture is, obviously expands the productivity. And they've now developed a technology to grow two staples for dealing with hunger. Wheat and rice have always been highly water dependent. They're water consumers. They've now developed means to grow wheat and rice with a fraction of the amount of water needed. So the more Israel can be shown is, look at the role we're playing internationally to deal with world hunger. Or here's what we do in the area of health. The more it does that, the more it reverts to the image it had pre-October 7th, 2023.
So my very last question, as we wrap up this interview, drawing from your experiences during the Oslo peace process, at the Camp David summit, and other negotiations you have led on this issue, what's the single most important lesson that policymakers should apply to avoid another cycle of collapse and violence?
I'll use one word: accountability. It becomes very important that we hold everybody accountable. The Israelis, Palestinians, Arab states. One key difference right now that we didn't have before: there is a readiness on the Arab side to assume a responsibility for Palestinians they'd never assumed before. Historically, their position was, it's up to the U.S. to produce this, or it's up to Israel to make all the concessions. Now, especially with the Gulf states, there's a recognition that their own agendas are affected by this issue in a way that for a few years, certainly after the Abraham Accords, there was a perception we don't have to somehow limit what we do because this issue is out there. Now there's a sense that you can't ignore the issue because it has a way of diverting your attention from what's important to you. That's a new factor here. And that creates it creates a new possibility. So I'm not without hope. I think there are possibilities here. I guess what I'm trying to say to you is it takes a real recognition of how fraught this is and the key points that allow you to get this process going. The sooner you have demonstrations of it on the ground, you really, part of the problem I worry about is if it takes another month to have the Board of Peace or the International Stabilization Force or the Technocratic Palestinian Committee, you may find that too much has happened on the ground already to reverse, to begin to implement. These are things that need to be deployed now, as soon as possible. If I see that happening, then the hope I've been expressing will be more realistically grounded.
Ambassador Ross, thank you so much for a great conversation.
My pleasure. I'm really glad to do it.